Hello, everybody. This is Don McLaren coming to you from Chicago, Illinois. It is August 2, 2015. Earlier today, I left New York City, flying in here to Chicago from LaGuardia Airport. I have spent a total of 9 years of my life in New York. I've been in and out of the city for many years. I lived in New York mostly from between 2001 and 2010. I want to talk about some of my first experiences in New York and in a New York City that was very different, and New York City that was looked at through the eyes of a man who was much younger and a much different person than he is now, who is, of course, yours truly. I first arrived in New York City in 1969, February. I came there with my parents, went there with my parents and my four siblings. I was 9 years old. We were actually on a trip to somewhere else, but that's another story for another time. We stayed in the city 2 or 3 days or so. New York City was in the midst of a terrible snowstorm when we arrived, and actually the snowstorm paralyzed the city for quite some time. So that was my introduction to New York. Fast forward to January 1983, right after I'd gotten out of the U.S. Navy, after completing my contract for active duty. I spent a little over 4 years in the Navy. Was released from the USS Coral Sea under honorable conditions. The Navy asked me to reenlist, but I chose not to. I left the Navy in December 1982. My ship was homeported in San Francisco Bay. After leaving the Navy, I took a trip across the North American continent through the U.S. and Canada, and arrived in New York mid-January '83 on a bus from Boston at the Port Authority bus terminal at the corner of 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. And my first encounter with New York on this solo trip was a guy who confronted me, and he was bumming change in the Port Authority. I had my big Navy Sea bag over one shoulder and another big bag over another shoulder, and I was didn't bother to stop to give the gentleman change. He certainly looked like he needed change and probably needed something else like heroin. Second image that comes to mind in my New York City journey was a few minutes later. I exited the Port Authority onto 8th Avenue and hailed a cab and got in a cab, and in front of the cab I was riding in, there was a gentleman cleaning the windshield of that cab. The gentleman was cleaning the windshield with a crumpled newspaper, and it was a cold evening in New York with a lot of slush on the ground, and the gentleman who was attempting to clean the windshield was in bare feet, holding the newspaper in one hand, cleaning the windshield of the cab, holding his pants up with his other hand. He was one of what was called the squeegee men. A squeegee man was a person who would come up to cabs or come up to cars at red lights in the city, and either with a squeegee, with a crumpled newspaper, or with his hand, with whatever device he could use, cleaning the windshields of cars and hoping to get some money from the driver for doing so. And I departed Port Authority for the Hotel Chelsea on 23rd Street. I'd heard about the Hotel Chelsea. I'd been in Montreal a week or so earlier and talked to a guy I met in a bar. He had been in Vietnam. He'd been a soldier in the Vietnam War, although he's Canadian, married to an American woman. And I told him I was going to New York, and he suggested the Hotel Chelsea. And I already knew that people like Bob Dylan had stayed there, many other artists, writers, etc. And as it turned out, there were no rooms available at the Chelsea. However, I did run into somebody in the lobby of the Chelsea who said he could sublet me a room. And so I took him up on his offer, and the room was on East 9th Street between First Avenue and Avenue A on the Lower East Side. What was called the Lower East Side now is called the East Village. The Lower East Side and all of New York City were very different then compared to now. That era is what I think of as the old New York, the New York that I first came into contact with, the New York of graffiti all over the subway cars, prostitutes openly plying their trade in the streets, drug dealers openly plying their trade in the streets. And as it turned out, East Ninth between Avenue A and First Ave was a locus of drug activity. People, maybe 5, 6 people on an average day in New York, any time, selling drugs on that one block area. I spent 18 days in the city that trip. I loved it. I met some great people. I'd been scared of going to New York alone, and even people today are scared of going to New York alone for their first trip there. I didn't need to be scared. Actually, when New York was supposedly dirty, dangerous, and all that, I never had any problems with getting mugged or anything like that. I went to New York several times between January '83 and January '91. I hitchhiked from San Francisco across the continent in the summer of 1986, and went there again in '88, '90, and '91. And in March 1991, I went to Japan, which started another interesting chapter in my life. You may have read about in the stories published on my website or heard about in videos I posted on this channel. So for me, there's the old New York and the new New York, and there's the older me, which was a much younger man, and there's the now me, the middle-aged man. I have changed, New York City have changed, but fundamentally I think we're both the same. Both pretty damn good when we want to be, and sometimes we can be a little bit mean and nasty. So I'm very happy that I did take it upon myself to journey to New York. The city has made me a richer person, and I will later in subsequent videos talk more about New York and my experiences in the city. But for now, I want to say that I am actually leaving New York, leaving the United States later this month, mid-August 2015. I'll be returning to China. I spent a year in New York, beginning July 2014, returning from 4 years in China. I've spent a total of 9 years or so in New York City, been in and out. Most of the time I spent in New York was between 2001 and 2010. With a few side trips to Latin America, Japan, in that time period. So thank you very much for tuning in. This will be continued. Au revoir.